Over the past few years, YouTube has given rise to a new genre of horror, resulting in many creative masterpieces such as The Mandela Catalog, The Backrooms, Gemini Home Entertainment, and more that I'm sure you're familiar with. These series all fall under the umbrella of analog horror. For the few who are unaware, analog horror basically just means horror that is presented through an analog medium, such as through old TV broadcasts, PSAs, presentations, or found footage. The wonderful thing about analog horror is that it allows the creator to craft an intriguing story with maximum creativity and full independence through a medium that almost everyone uses to some extent: YouTube. Recently though, a new series has appeared that hardly anyone seems to be talking about. It truly seems to me that aside from a few reactions from large content creators, this series has simply fallen under the radar despite hefty view counts on its two most popular entries. What am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about Vita Carnis by Darian Quilloy. Darian has managed to hit the ground running with an intriguing premise and an engaging mystery hiding in the shadows of each entry. And today I want to bring you through each entry individually and then analyze everything and try to come up with a clear picture as to what is really going on. And before we begin, I'd like to direct all of you to Darian's channel and Ko-fi, which will be at the top of the description. Please, please, please make sure to support the original creator. With all that out of the way, let's take a deep dive into Vita Carnis. The first 7 videos in Vita Carnis are a part of a documentary from the National Living Meat Research Organization. The documentary consists of 8 parts, and the only way to view the final part is to watch the entire compiled documentary, so we'll be ignoring the first 7 videos and just starting there. The documentary opens with the description of the beauty of nature and evolution. However, it seems that in 1931, a new type of organism began to rapidly populate the planet, seemingly out of nowhere. Though many speculated they may be of demonic or extraterrestrial origin, the documentary claims that the scientists behind the research have determined it is actually of Earth origin, but they still don't really know how that's possible. It then goes on to describe the creatures as being mostly composed of muscle, organs, and bone, appearing very similarly to mammals lacking skin, or like store-bought meat. Their diet mainly consists of eating the flesh of other mammals, though any organic matter seems to be viable for some of them. Despite that, an important detail is stressed in that they do not seem to consume any of their own species. Due to the aforementioned characteristics, the species has been aptly named Vita Carnis, which is Latin for the life of the flesh. The first of 8 known subspecies of Vita Carnis is the crawl. Crawl is a plant-like organism that grows similarly to vines or fungi, with a dark red appearance. The ends of its tendrils gather organic material and nutrients from the surrounding area. It also has a rudimentary form of photosynthesis that it can use to supplement itself if need be. Because of how efficient its natural processes are, it can thrive in almost any environment on the planet. And because the dead branches fall off and decay into nutrient-rich soil, it actually highly benefits the ecosystem around it. It's even cultivated by humans as a sort of super fertilizer. Occasionally, a small node or bud will grow on a branch of crawl, and eventually break off and grow into its own independent organism, and this is where the next species comes into play. The trimmings begin by growing off of the crawl. They then proceed to seek out anything organic they can find to eat. Eventually, they'll grow into small skinless mammals approximately the size and stature of a raccoon. Interestingly enough, every individual trimming is unique in some way. They may have a varied amount of limbs or other unique aesthetic features. The only characteristics that all of them share is generally being about 8 inches in length or about the size of a basketball. They are also almost entirely comprised of muscle and meat tissue. They reach maturity at 7 months and have a maximum lifespan of 2 to 4 years. Its personality is very docile. In fact, to most, they're more of a nuisance than anything else, which is kind of funny. They screech when feeling threatened and kind of just do it for no reason as well. And scavenging through people's trash to look for food is a regular occurrence for them. Due to their timid nature and lack of defensive capability, they're near the bottom of the food chain, and because of this, they highly benefit any ecosystem with predators. Despite this, their population is never in danger, as they can be found in abundance wherever crawl can be found, which is, like I said, pretty much everywhere. Despite humans struggling to find a proper method of incorporating them into society due to them pretty much just being an annoyance, some people found that keeping them as pets was actually a pleasant idea, which, I mean... The next species on our list is the meat snake. The meat snake also branches off from the crawl at a young age, and it consists of various types of meat coated in a transparent skin-like membrane. Once mature, it averages about 16 feet, but also can grow far larger depending on its diet. It is known to have lived up to 40 years. Because of its lack of appendages and slow movement, it is pretty much entirely incapable of feeding on a live animal, and as a result, it's a scavenger. This is further accentuated by its tongue-like organ that is coated in sensors that it uses to sense particles from decaying meat, kind of like a real snake. It is not hostile, only defending itself when threatened or while feeding. The food that it eats gets broken down in the stomach for nutrients and sustenance, and the rest of it moves down the digestive system to the end of the snake and becomes incorporated in its own structure, which is how it mainly increases its length. It also has a very unique property of borrowing and using the skull of its prey as its own. During its life, it will swap and replace its skulls as needed. The meat snake has no natural predators and can only be killed through starvation, burning, or destruction of its skin membrane. Surprisingly, the meat snake is also the only of the Carnis species with the ability to reproduce, independent of the crawl. If it determines its size to be excessive and other conditions are met, it will split into two smaller meat snakes through mitosis, and they will then go their separate ways. Meat snakes can only be found in moderate temperatures. As such, they are not nearly as common as the aforementioned crawl and trimmings. Humanity has actually found a good use for them, as they can be used to get rid of large amounts of unwanted carcasses or bodies and prevent the spread of disease in the process, as the enzymes in their stomachs will sterilize anything that they excrete. The next species of the Carnis is the mimic. It's the most human-looking of any of the Carnis, though it has generally exaggerated proportions comparatively, such as its height, limbs, and appendage length, the obvious lack of skin, and their bulging eyes. Their teeth are almost entirely composed of incisors, which are the ones used mostly for cutting. Along with their gaping jaw, it's perfect for swallowing large chunks of flesh, and their diet consists almost solely of humans. Because of this, they're only found around areas with human populations, otherwise they would just starve. Its life cycle begins as a crawl offshoot, very similarly to the trimming, and as they grow, they progress from smaller to larger and larger animals, eventually preferring to hunt humans. The mimic is actually very, very intelligent. They hunt for easy targets and will actually stalk you to learn your routine, and attack you when you are most vulnerable. It is even known to use objects such as clothes, furniture, or mannequins to hide or conceal itself. Because people are generally most vulnerable at night while they're sleeping, this is when they prefer to strike. Once you are asleep, they will silently approach you, and then attack and kill you near instantly, and begin to feed. If you aren't asleep, then it will instead use a repertoire of sounds to startle and coerce its target into a corner, and it will then swiftly attack and attempt to do the same thing as before. After eating its fill, it will swiftly vacate populated areas into a place where it won't be interrupted, and begin to digest its meal. If a mimic has a consistent supply of humans, it will eventually begin to exhibit characteristics of humans, growing skin and hair. Eventually, it will look almost identical to a human, making it possible for it to simply blend in with human civilization. However, if a mimic has an overabundance of humans to feed on, it will instead evolve into an elder mimic. Its proportions become even more exaggerated, and it becomes an even more efficient and fierce hunter. Its skin becomes dark, teeth recede from its mouth to its throat, and it grows a strange, mask-like pale skin layer over its face. Since mimics are obviously a natural predator to humans, world governments have released instructions to the public on how to combat them. Rule number 1. Don't travel alone, especially in areas known to have mimic sightings. Rule number 2. If you encounter a stationary mimic that seems undisturbed by your presence, quietly and swiftly leave the location and alert authorities. It is likely digesting a meal. Rule number 3. If a mimic pursues you, at all costs, do not get yourself into a position where the possibility of being cornered even exists. Mimics do not like to chase prey that they do not think they can trap. Rule number 4. If a conflict with a mimic is inevitable, roll into a ball, protecting your vital points, and make as much noise as possible to alert the surrounding area. Rule number 5. If you have a weapon, do not use it. Mimics are incredibly resilient and are likely to be unfazed by general attacks. Gunshots or blunt weapons will not work. Instead, use it as a barrier between you and the mimic. Rule number 6. If a mimic is present but has not seen you, hide behind or under natural cover or furniture in a low position. Mimics rarely stay long to search for prey and will not pursue if they are unaware of you. Occasionally, a crawl bud will not actually break off, but rather grow continuously until transforming into a harvester. The harvester will then produce its own tendrils independent of the crawl. Harvester bulbs are about 10 feet tall and 7 feet wide, but their two groups of tendrils extend underground for up to nearly 500 feet. The first type of tendril is a barbed one that contains two potent venoms with no known cure. One side of the barbs excretes an anticoagulant and the other a powerful neurotoxin. The second type of tendril is similar in composition to crawl branches, and it's used to drag prey caught on the first tendrils underground for decomposition and consumption. After feeding on a corpse under the surface, the ground surrounding it becomes nutrient-rich, promoting plant growth and attracting small animals. The harvester has a strange tendency to not actually attack these smaller animals at all. However, there are 3 possible reasons. It may determine the energy expenditure is simply not worth the effort, or it purposefully leaves them to attract larger animals which it will then feed on, or maybe even a combination of both. Harvesters are relatively rare, primarily being found in wooded forests in the northern hemisphere. Because of this, you are unlikely to encounter one if you're not hiking, and warning signs should be present. Regardless, they are very dangerous for obvious reasons. If you believe you have accidentally stumbled into the territory of a harvester, you are encouraged to throw away any heavy items you may have on you to distract it and slowly shuffle away from the area, making no sudden movements and making absolutely sure to not panic, no matter what. Once you are absolutely sure you're out of the range, you may now escape safely and alert authorities of its position. The final conventional species is the host of influence, or just the host. The hosts are incredibly rare, found solely in North America, and only 2 pictures of them alive exist. They are vaguely humanoid, with its head, arm-like appendages, and torso, but everything from the navel down are plant-like tendrils that allow it to burrow into the ground. It doesn't have skin and mostly consists of muscle. It has some armor-like meat plates to cover areas of exposure, and its mouth slit sits near the neck muscles. Its back has many hair-like structures that act as nozzles to emit spores. The spores are incredibly hazardous and can be carried large distances by the wind. If inhaled by a person, they will begin to succumb to ever-worsening symptoms after a few hours, until eventually becoming entranced. Perhaps entranced is too weak of a word to describe it, it's more like straight-up mind control. The infected person will then attempt to make their way to the host who affected them, and if they succeed, will offer themselves up as a meal to the host. If the infected person does not reach the host within 36 hours of infection, then the symptoms will slowly begin to fade and the person will return to normal. If a host determines that its location is not sufficient for acquiring meals, it will uproot itself and relocate to another spot that it deems fit. The last two species of Carnis are the strangest. The first of these two is the monoliths. The monoliths are strange for many reasons. For one, they only appeared for the first time in June of 1972, and there's only 7 of them. On top of that, they arrange themselves in a circle about a mile in diameter and in a specific location. They're also nearly 400 feet tall and do not move or do much of anything unless provoked. They are located in a redacted part of the world. At some point, a team had attempted to approach the monoliths, and they were wiped out nearly instantly. Upon the government learning of this, the military attempted to attack them, which revealed that they were capable of EMP blasts that would wipe out entire fleets of modern military effortlessly. Following this, they simply fenced the area off, and nobody is allowed to go in there anymore. The final member of the Carnis species is the Singularity. The Singularity does not share any known qualities with the other Carnis members, and little about it is understood. It appears as a glistening orb about 3 feet in diameter and suspends itself in the air using an unknown force. It is known to emit magnetic pulses and unknown energy signals at regular frequencies for reasons unknown. The population is also unknown. It is implied that much more is known about the Singularity than is let on, but information is highly restricted outside of a redacted organization. It may be the government or someone else. We do not know. The documentary was a fantastic way to introduce the audience to the universe. The rules have been established, the pieces are all in play, and now Darien can explore the established concepts in more general types of analog methods. For example, the next entry in the series is Cook at Home Kitchen, Cheese Crawl Penne, Cook Along. Based on the beginning of the video, we can assume that this takes place from the perspective of someone flipping through channels. While the ingredients are being listed, a flavor enhancer from Nutrier Company is referenced, supposedly the most crucial ingredient. Most of the rest of the video is normal, though we do get to see what crawl actually looks like for a brief moment, and it's kind of gross. At the end, the music becomes off-key and unsettling, and the voice says to make sure that the flavor enhancer is only applied when the dish has cooled to below 140 degrees Fahrenheit. When the program is done, the viewer turns off the television. A static noise slowly crescendos as a difficult-to-make-out image appears in the darkness until the video suddenly ends. What is that red triangle symbol? And why is this person trying to figure out what they are? The next entry is Guide to Owning a Pet Trimming. This is the same as the previous entry, being a televised program that is being watched by someone. The video begins by introducing other common pets known for having human companionship, and then introduces the trimming. It then transitions into the steps required to take care of a trimming pet. I have to say, the trimming prop that Darien made for the purpose of this video is fucking phenomenal, and kudos to him for that. Like, this thing actually looks awesome. Emphasized as being the most important, the temperature of your house is what the guide starts with. Though they are resilient in various temperatures, they are most comfortable at a nice, cool room temperature of about 64 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit. However, it is said that they actually prefer warmer environments to nest or sleep. The easiest setup is a box with enough blankets for them to cover themselves. For food, dry cat or dog food twice a day is perfectly fine for a healthy trimming, but you can feed them any food scraps as a treat, as they will eat basically anything if provided. Next, the guide says that it is very important to remember that they are nocturnal and make a bunch of noise, and, yeah, they definitely do. As a solution, it proposes to feed the trimming in the early morning, so it's active during these times instead. You should also make sure a trimming has plenty of space and access to a backyard. If not, regular walks are encouraged. This is especially so because trimmings are social creatures, and walks will allow them to meet other trimmings. Though they are relatively inactive, they also enjoy simple toys that they can push around, carry, or pull. Another social aspect that they especially enjoy is listening to the TV or the radio. When they get dirty, you just have to give them a simple bath. Make sure to avoid getting soap in their eyes, nose, or mouth. Finally, the guide says to make sure you give them lots of love and care. They love being cuddled, pat on the head, and talking to them also makes them happy. Their lifespan in this guide is said to be about 8 to 12 years, dramatically increased from the 2 to 4 from the documentary. After it ends, the TV is turned off, and we hear sounds of writing for some reason. The next entry is MeatSnakeSpecimen archived footage. It begins with a black screen and the sounds of someone fumbling with a VHS tape. Until the tape is inserted, and it starts with this warning message. Warning: the unauthorized reproduction, distribution, or viewing of the following footage is strictly prohibited. Infringement of these instructions leads to severe penalties enforced by federal law. Discard this tape immediately. So clearly, whoever's watching this should not own these tapes, but they do anyways. The tape describes a situation that occurred at the end of World War II in 1945. While exploring an underground tunnel, a cleanup team discovered a supermassive meat snake, so large that it acted as an impenetrable wall. It was at least 100 feet long, or about 30.4 meters. Its mouth had cow skulls arranged in a circular fashion, and its skin was ridiculously durable, holding its own against extreme cold or heat and radiation exposure. It also had an unusual dark red coloration. When the other side of the meat snake was found by a separate team, they made a discovery on how it got so large in the first place. It then cuts quickly to a shot of a pile of bones, and then cuts out before details can be described. It is also said that it has a strangely pleasant smell emanating from its skin, contrasting the usual sour smell of rotting flesh from normal specimens. It describes how at a later date the meat snake had somehow entirely disappeared. It then flashes a quick image of a man whose face is censored, and the video ends. Considering the properties that we know of meat snakes, if they are in the right conditions and determine they are too large that they can split off from each other, I think that that's probably what happened. The next and longest entry in the series is Mimic Defense Instructional Tape. It begins with narration describing an increase in missing persons as of October 23, 1986. This is due to an increase in the mimic population. This specific tape is publicly released by the Canadian government in an effort to educate the public on how to avoid being killed. It begins by talking about mimic behaviors that we're already aware of. However, we're provided with new, haunting images to show how good they actually are at hiding in furniture. We also learned that the reason why they can do this, despite being so large, is that they are actually able to contort their body at will, making themselves smaller to fit in tight spaces and larger to appear threatening when appropriate. We also learn in more detail why and how they put on clothes to disguise themselves. Their bright red skin and bulging eyes are dead giveaways for their identity, so they use this to hide in densely populated areas. We also get clarification on the evolved human-appearing mimics. They still maintain the features such as their smile, bulging eyes, and disproportionately large appendages, no matter what, so it is never impossible to identify them. On top of that, since mimic legs are long and hunched, their walking pattern is also identifiable as irregular. The tape then transitions to another section on how to actually defend yourself against them. If a mimic is before you, it is best to appear large, maintain eye contact, and make noise. If you have a weapon such as a gun, you should aim for the legs and head to immobilize them. This video reiterates that if you find a mimic who hasn't noticed you, you should try to get away without making yourself known and call the authorities. If it does notice you, you're instructed to simply run and hide. Do not leave your hiding spot until authorities have arrived. After this, the instructional tape ends, and another tape begins. Evidence tape, Christopher and Janice case, 1983. Observe footage for confidential information completed. Discard and destroy all copies of this tape immediately. It starts with Christopher figuring out how to use his camcorder.
Got it. Let's see. Yep, it's working.
He seems to be recording a nighttime stroll along with another person, Janice. Since it's so dark, he turns on a flashlight and turns the camera to Janice, and we see that the faces in the footage are censored in post. Most of the footage consists of them just engaging in casual conversation and taking a nighttime stroll.
Got some light now. But look at that over there. You can't see anything unless I point directly over there.
At about 7 minutes, the recording resets, and he says that the camera still turns off and on randomly sometimes.
Turning on and off, but it's the only thing that they would give me. It works though, I just gotta watch.
This is gnarly.
It's not my fault this guy lives in a fucking dump. We're almost there, we just gotta get through the woods.
From now on, the recording will now occasionally cut off randomly for small periods of time and jump to a further spot. After finding an old buried car and some more uneventful walking through the woods, he passes the camera to Janice and she starts filming him. He then describes what happened. In the year 1980, a teenage boy was coming home from a trailer late at night. Although when he arrived at home, he found a grisly scene. Here a name is said, and I can't quite figure out what the first name is supposed to be, but it's not as important as the last name, which is Barrere, his father. The grisly scene lied before him, and the police were called. They came to investigate. The strange thing, though, the police immediately closed off everything. No one was allowed near, and only a few witnesses were actually able to catch a glimpse of what had really happened. For some reason, the police were acting very strange and trying to keep everyone away and giving away as little information as possible. When the information finally was released to the public, they framed it as a suicide. The police have yet to clarify anything related to the case since. From there, they go for a few more takes and then decide they're done and continue walking. Chris jokes that while they were filming, the narration was the perfect time for them to get jumped by a serial killer.
Yeah, because back there was the perfect time for a serial killer to just jump out and grab us, you know?
Cut it out. It's scary enough as is.
Janice tells him to cut it out and continues talking to him for a little while, until she realizes Chris has stopped responding. Chris is gone.
Chris! Come on! This isn't funny! Chris! I just want to go home, come on! Fine, I guess I'm going home without you. I'm cold, tired, and hungry. If you want to stay out here and play games, you can.
She assumes that he's just playing a game because of what he just said, but then, over a minute of silence, just the sound of her footsteps and the forest. Until then.
Funny. Oh! God!
The second to last episode as of this video is Species Anomaly Report. This one does not begin with the TV, but rather a personal computer. Carnis Species Log number 014. Abnormality Documentation Harvester. Notable population density shift discovered between the dates of August 1st, 1989 and October 1st, 1989. Maps display the charted population of Harvester's location on a monthly basis. It then cuts to the August 1st map until glitching, going black, and playing noises from nature. A distorted black and white photo of a family fades into frame, and some other blurred forest pictures and sounds are shown. Then, oh god, some incredibly disturbing bits of audio and imagery. This is probably the worst episode. I hate it. Sirens echo in the distance. It seems a mother and her child have fallen victim to a harvester while hiking. The final entry is Flavor Enhancer Commercial. This video showcases multiple different commercials from Nutri Co. advertising their new enhanced recipe, the Flavor Enhancer Deluxe. In the first commercial, a sales graph is shown. Even just in the months following the original product's release, the sales have skyrocketed tremendously. As the commercials progress, the meals that are being showcased become simpler and simpler and simpler, until eventually it's just a slice of toast. Then, it slowly devolves from a commercial with subliminal messaging into a downright brainwashing session.
It is crucial to everyday eating. You need the flavor enhancer to enjoy eating. You need the flavor enhancer. Consume. You need it. You must need it. You must. Consume.
With that, we've covered every episode so far of Vita Carnis. Now that we've gone through every episode, I want to talk about all the details that most people likely missed. And then I'll try to put together a timeline of events once I'm done. Let's start with the basics. The translated Latin names of all the Carnis. The trimming is Ignovus Carnis, lazy flesh. The meat snake is Mutuari Carnis, to borrow flesh. The mimic is Trucidatum Carnis, the slaughter of the flesh. The harvester is Congregantur Carnis, the gathering of the flesh. The host is Imperium Carnis, which can be Empire of the Flesh or Commander of the Flesh. The monoliths are Coelum Carnis, or the Heaven of the Flesh. And finally, the singularity is Verum Carnis, or the Truth of the Flesh. On top of that, I think it is worth noting that in the documentary, the Carnis are listed in order of rarity, from most common at the beginning to least common heading towards the end. Another very easy to miss detail is this island in the Hudson Bay. This island does not exist in the real world at all, and it's also definitely where the monoliths are, and the place where the harvesters were gathering towards in 1990. Despite meat snakes and harvesters being most comfortable in very specific environments, they seem to thrive on this island specifically. despite them not appearing anywhere near the shore off the island. The most important detail in the story is the subtle single-frame images that pop up from time to time, most of which I've neglected to mention until now. And the most crucial of these is the currently 13-page storybook that we've received through these Easter eggs. I'm now going to read you the short story, and keep in mind that because the images are blurry, some words are indecipherable, so some details are going to be missing. Once upon a time, there was a distant kingdom. The kingdom was... The royal family were magical. They traveled land and sea to discover new places and learn what. During the travels on one of their expeditions, a great storm struck. It was so powerful, it swayed the boat the royal family rowed and pushed the prince out and into the sea. After being stranded at sea, the young prince eventually was cast to an island. Injured, the prince stumbled his way into a nearby cave. The prince used what magic he could to put himself into a healing sleep, but the prince's sleep was long. He slept for what seemed like forever. As he slept, the land around him changed and grew. It was unrecognizable from when the prince had first arrived. But the sleep still needed time to heal the prince, much more time, but it kept the prince safe while he rested, guarding him from the elements as the land changed. Outside the cave, during a time of hardship, lived the island critters. The critters were struggling in this hard time. There was barely any food to go around. They would go and gather what they could. Although one day, the critters found the cave while searching for food. They found the prince in his trance and his healing sleep. The critters were so awestruck and enchanted by the prince's magic. Who is this creature? Why are they here? Are they dangerous? A thought was brought up. What if this creature could use its magic to help them? It may grow food, or heal sickness. They continued to argue about the prince and his magic. In the end, the majority of the critters agreed that the prince was dangerous and should not be meddled with, although the other critters ignored the rest of their fellow kind. Instead, they secretly visited the slumbering visitor. They snuck what little food they had and carefully fed it to the prince, greatly hastening their recovery. One day, the prince awoke suddenly. Thanks to the critters' assistance, the healing process had finished very quickly. The prince had fully recovered and was now fully awake and aware of their surroundings. Surprised by the sudden awakening, the critters ducked and hid from the prince's sight. One of the critters built up the courage to meet the now awake stranger. They crawled to the prince's side and extended their hand in friendship. The prince reached back, and together they had formed the bond that will change their fate. The critters led the prince out of the cave, up to the top of the hill the prince had been buried under, and showed them the forest. This is our home, full of wonder and beauty, although the forest struggles to provide for all of us critters and we are facing disaster. Can you help us? The prince stood back, spread his arms, and before him grew a bright light. Mystical shapes and colors, lights and figures. The critters watched with wide eyes. Such sublime brilliance. The prince completed his display. He vowed, with the power he held and the help of his kingdom, he shall heal their home. Now, something you may have noticed instantly is the flag on the prince's raft. Does it seem familiar? Yes, it's the logo for Netschreier Co., the company that manufactured the flavor enhancer. It's also present here, and here. The flavor enhancer obviously has the capability to brainwash. If you remember the massive meat snake from World War II, there was also an image in that entry that showed an officer with the same logo on his uniform, allegedly all the way back in 1945. The event was also referenced in a newspaper clipping from the documentary, which claims that the meat snake only got that large because of cult activity. But wait a minute. This newspaper says it was 40 meters long, and that it was in 1947. But the one that we're already familiar with was 30.4 meters long, and in 1945. That means there's 2 of them. So it seems like a cult represented by a red triangle, that the prince also flies as his banner, is directly assisting or supporting the Carnis in some way, and they're possibly in positions of power because of this officer, and attempting to recruit more to their cause through the flavor enhancer? Perhaps. Another detail I'd like to point out to segue into the rest of my analysis is this seemingly random criminal wanted ad in the 2nd episode, the cheese crawl Penne cook-along, Vincent Barrere. When I first watched this, I thought it was really strange that Darien would suddenly reveal a fully named human character, especially in the 2nd episode. It had to mean something. This is where the evidence tape of Christian and Janice comes into play. If you remember, while they were out in the woods recording, Christian was talking about a case from 1980 in which a child came back to their trailer home to find their father dead. Due to the quiet nature of the clip, I couldn't actually figure out what the first name of this victim was, but that doesn't matter. What does matter is his last name.
Detail Barrere. His father, that he came home to, is found dead.
This implies that the child is most likely Vincent Barrere, who would go on to be a wanted man 10 years later. Remember, as well, that the police did not allow anyone to observe the crime scene and ruled it as a suicide. Another thing I also thought was very strange was how much Christian and Janice completely lacked any sense of danger related to mimics while walking outside at night. They also couldn't immediately assume the 1980 case with Vincent's father was obviously a mimic incident, and neither could any of the public. How is this possible? From here, all the pieces are in place, so allow me to deliver my current hypothetical series timeline. And I'd like to preface that due to the lack of and nature of the information we've received in the series so far, this timeline is probably completely wrong. I just want to deliver my interpretation of events thus far. At some point in the distant past, a being of possible extraterrestrial origin that we know as the Prince is separated from his family and finds himself stranded, wounded, on an island that doesn't exist in our reality. The reason why I believe that it's extraterrestrial, despite the documentary saying this isn't true, is because of the lines, "The royal family were magical, and they traveled land and sea to discover new places." I believe this could be a representation of intergalactic travel. It's also possible that the royal family were just magical humans and they lived on Earth a long time ago. He puts himself into a deep sleep in order to recover himself, and much time passes and the world changes around him. At some point, the critters would find the prince and nurse him back to health by feeding him despite being low on food themselves. This part is kind of tricky. After a lot of brainstorming, every time I tried to assign a role to the critters, I found it not making sense somewhere down the line. So for now, due to a lack of information, I'm not going to assign them to any group of humans or representations of nature or anything like that. I'm just going to call them critters. As shown in the monolith photos, this island was highly developed by humans prior to them appearing in 1972. There is a whole ass building here. And clearly the building wasn't built for the sake of research, because the first research team that went in was wiped out instantly. I also do not believe that this island is a supernatural construct created by the singularity or whatever, because I've seen other people say this, but I think that there was also a decent-sized population of humans that lived here at some point, and I think it's just an island that doesn't exist in our real world. To me, it seems the storybook is being portrayed from a third-person perspective, but following the prince as a protagonist. I do not think his sense of time is reliable, especially because the story claims his sleep was long and lasted what seemed like forever. The story also claims that the critters were experiencing a famine and that they had to gather for food. Because it specifies that they had to gather food, this is why I believe it is probably unlikely that they're humans, but it could just be an exaggeration for the sake of the storybook aesthetic. I really don't know. It's too vague. Suddenly, in 1931, the prince woke up much earlier than he was meant to, due to their help. Then they lead the prince to the top of the hill and show him their home, which was in disaster. I believe this disaster may have been the human development on the island, which was deforesting the critters' home. And I believe the forest could also represent nature as a whole, if the critters were to represent maybe animals as a whole, and it really is just kind of like an environmental message that is being portrayed here. I think that's very likely. It's too vague. It's hard for me to tell. I think that this is why the Carnis in general is so beneficial to the ecosystem at large. After the impressive display of magic, the critters ask the prince, "Can you save us?" And in response, he uses his magic to create the Vita Carnis, which is his kingdom. They then appear all over the world seemingly overnight, which is why I believe that they were created through his magic. Its sole purpose, to preserve the forest, the critters' home, with Carnis that benefited the ecosystem in previously unfathomable ways, and to quell the human population, which are those responsible for the threat against them and their home. The newspaper shows that a group of 400 trimmings congregated underneath an abandoned satellite disk, and trimmings are also known to enjoy listening to the radio and TV. I believe this is because the prince has the ability to communicate with his kingdom through his ability, which is part of his magic. With that, I believe that the prince leaving the island is representative of a sort of doomsday scenario that is actually yet to occur. The last line of the storybook says, "The prince gathered what he could and then set sail onward." Once the prince returns home, they, plural as in the prince and his kingdom, at least I'm assuming this is plural and not just referring to the prince's they, despite the male pronoun being used plenty of times to refer to him, will come back to the island and return to the critters. I believe this gathering of resources before the prince leaves is what we see for most of the story. By 1945, during the end of World War II, the Carnis had already established itself as a part of life. In the decade or so since their arrival, a cult had already formed with the goal of worshipping the Carnis. Many of these cult members were even in positions of power, as seen by the World War II officer who wore the same insignia the prince flew on his raft. Using the countless dead bodies left behind in the war, the cult grew a 30-meter meat snake which vanishes without a trace, probably because it simply split off and left, and maybe they retrieved it or brought it somewhere. Then the process was repeated in 1947 with a longer 40-meter meat snake. I believe these are to be fed to the singularity. This second occurrence makes it into the newspaper, but later the evidence tapes documenting this would be considered illegal to carry. Fast forwarding to 1972, the population of the Carnis explodes, roughly coinciding with the appearance of the monoliths on the island. I believe the monoliths are there to protect the singularity while he is gathering strength and to prevent humans from interacting with his home. The military attacks on them fail, and the area is then fenced off, never to be touched again. Around this time, a group of researchers attempts to publish their findings on the Vita Carnis, but is silenced by the government. A $500,000 fine is assigned to anyone possessing the tape of the presentation they created, and information is being purposefully withheld from the public. At this point, I believe the Vita Carnis and the cult have infiltrated higher government. By 1980, even the local police force was affected. A mimic attack on a father is covered up and made out to be a suicide, and for some reason, because of information being withheld, the public can't even assume that it was probably a mimic. But his son, Vincent Barrere, is still alive, and he knows, at least partially, what really happened. He doesn't understand why his father's death is falsely identified as a suicide, and 3 years later, in 1983, Christopher and Janice fall victim to a mimic attack. I believe their lack of any awareness to be careful for mimics considering their circumstances points towards the public, again, being misled about the nature of the Carnis due to government corruption. They seem to be withholding the information that they can get away with, but other obvious things, such as the existence of the trimmings, the crawl, and the meat snakes, are not hidden, because obviously, how could you? With the mimics, though, it seems like you could get away with chopping it up to suicide, murders, or simple disappearances. That is until 1986, where the mimic cases get so bad and so frequent that the government decides that they can't hide it anymore. However, because the mimic entry in the documentary claims world nations have released instructions on mimic defense, despite that documentary being illegal in at least Canada, it may be evidence that other governments have not managed to be infiltrated by the cult. This part is really confusing, because it honestly just seems like that Darien may have forgotten to make them obviously aware of mimics by walking out at night, and that I'm just thinking way too hard about it, but I think it could be interesting. However, this tape, while mostly true, contains some facts that directly contradict the information that we know from the documentary, such as the use of weapons. In the older documentary, it's said that the weapons are ineffective against the mimics. However, in the defense instructional tape, it says that you are encouraged to use them, which seems entirely detrimental to your safety. At some point around this time, I believe an older Vincent Barrere, still bitter about the cover-up of his father's death and confused, has begun to do some of his own digging. I believe the first thing that he uses for his research was the guide to owning a pet trimming, as it seems like something that would be available publicly, and we can hear notes being taken by hand as the program ends, which contrasts the later entry, which is done on a personal computer. An inconsistency I noted earlier that I'd like to point out is that the guide claims trimmings live for twice as long as the documentary states, though it's likely because they're just much safer when kept as pets. Years go by, and somehow Vincent manages to get his hands on a handful of illegal tapes. I believe all of the tapes that begin with a federal warning are actually us watching the tapes through his perspective, as he attempts to learn more and more. Eventually, he uncovers the existence of the cult. As we can see in this image, he is trying to figure out who they are. Using the information he learns, he begins writing logs to document his findings. This can be seen in Species Anomaly Report, where he writes Carnis Species Log number 014, and notices the dramatic shift in the harvester population towards the end of 1989. This, paired with the sudden increase in mimic attacks from a few years prior to me, signals the end of the Carnis preparation. Doomsday is about to begin. The government, at some point, catches on to Vincent and becomes a wanted man. In June of 1990, New Trier Co. was founded by the cult, and they manufactured a mind control agent in the form of a flavor enhancer. Considering the similarity in their coloration and that it must be served at a low temperature, otherwise it burns, this is likely reverse engineered from host spores. The cult was actually able to get past this limitation of the Carnis with its MeatSnake experiment. As I stated earlier, the meat snake that had been fed many bodies created a hardened skin that was immune to extreme temperatures and radiation. As we know, the flavor enhancer works shockingly well against the public. A cooking show airs sometime before the production of the Flavor Enhancer Deluxe, but after June of 1990, when the Flavor Enhancer was made first available, just because I assume it would have been used in this recipe otherwise. And we can see Vincent is now wanted by the Canadian government, but has not yet been caught. Later that year, New Trier Co. releases the Deluxe Flavor Enhancer, and through a series of subliminal messaging and mind control campaigns seems to have successfully taken over at least a noticeable portion of the population that has had access to the Flavor Enhancer as a product, and they've become dependent on it. I believe that late 1990 may be very close to when everything goes wrong, and December 1990 in the sales projection seems to be the furthest date on our timeline. Oof, damn. That timeline definitely didn't take me an entire day to figure out the logistics of. There's definitely a lot of things I struggle to make sense of, so if you disagree with my timeline or have a different interpretation, I'd love to hear your thoughts and comments. Anyways, I hope I speak for everyone when I say that I think Darian has something truly special on his hands here, and I'm seriously looking forward to future entries of Vita Carnis. Everyone, please go subscribe to Darian's channel. It'll be the very first link in the description, along with his coffee and his Twitter if you'd like to support him further. Also, thank you guys so much for 20,000 subscribers, though I'm sure the number will be much bigger by the time that most people watch this. It's a pretty cool number. That being said, I hope you all have a great day or night or whatever time it is for you, and I hope you enjoyed. That's gonna be all from me. Thanks for watching. Until next time.